Okay, thank you, Eyal. Eyal Tirosh is a service analyst in Gartner Research, where he's the part of the digital workplace security team. His research efforts are focused primarily on technologies and strategies for application security and digital workplace security.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, it's not the right one? What did I push? Oh. It's fine?
Okay, so it's not going to be here? Okay.
Yeah, there you can see it.
Hey, hello everybody. My name's Eyal Tirosh, and I'm a senior research analyst at Gartner. If you're not familiar with Gartner, we're an IT research and analysis firm. We were mentioned in one of the slides earlier around cool vendors. So I was asked to come here today and talk a little bit about application security trends that we're observing. And there's a number of, I think, application security companies as well as in Israel, some of which became cool vendors. So I just wanted to take a quick look here at first, kind of what's the current state of application security as we see it. It's not always good. And then what are the trends in application security that Gartner is observing? By the way, you'll see Gartner a lot on the slide. I'm probably not the right person to talk to about the company overall, but if you wanted to, you could talk to Nancy down here in the front row. So first, like I said, what's sort of the current state of application security? It's in a lot of situations, it's much of the same thing that we've been dealing with for years. And so one of the first things I wanted to show is that with respect to vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting and SQL injection, the type that people hear quite a bit about, these are things that folks have known about for literally over 15 years. There's a number of sort of workarounds that can be used beyond just sort of teaching about coding practices to deal with this, and yet they still keep appearing. And I just wanted to show a few numbers. Last year, cross-site scripting, according to Veracode, which is an application security testing vendor, they had found it in something like 50% of the web applications that they tested. And there's a good deal of web applications out there that aren't necessarily being tested as well. So the number itself is not entirely complete, I would say. And it's worth noting that these are companies that take application security seriously to some extent because they are sort of looking for these vulnerabilities in the code. And as I just said, not all of them are at that point yet. And it's also an increase, I think, year over year, which is interesting as well. But I wouldn't read too much into that because that might be a consequence, essentially, of more applications being tested. And just to look at kind of another source there, 60% or up to 60% of that web applications that White Hat Security tested were always vulnerable, according to them. And a lot of people focus quite a bit on cross-site scripting and SQL injection, and unfortunately I don't have the number for it here, but it's worth noting that a large part of the threat to organizations is not really in these, what I would call kind of custom coding vulnerabilities with respect to cross-site scripting and SQLI and other things in the OWASP top 10. There's a lot of reuse of third-party components, open source libraries and the like that contain known vulnerabilities in them as well. And there's a large exposure from there that's not being vetted to some extent. So I think Black Duck Software is a vendor that looks at open source components, and they, in their latest report, I think said 67% of the applications that they had taken a look into had components with known vulnerabilities. These are things like Heartbleed and stuff that people hear about quite a bit. The point is that, well, the numbers are not great. It's not necessarily improved year over year, and part of what we see on our side is that the reason for that is because application security at a lot of organizations is not very well understood, well kind of thought out, and it's very improvisational. So this is kind of how we see many organizations tackling it, which is a lot of the emphasis for application security is happening in terms of training their developers. And as I kind of described earlier, a lot of these situations have some workarounds through secure coding practices that could address that. but it hasn't completely addressed the problem. Then the developers, and I would say this is irrespective of the development methodology, they work quite a bit on developing the application, and then it gets essentially right before release into production, it gets tested for security vulnerabilities. Then there's a kind of a panic to address those, and many of them end up getting pushed into production, and then they start the cycle all over again. This sort of approach doesn't really scale. It may work on a sort of a single application project, but certainly won't, I think, across the board. And so you'll see that many of the vendors in the space are really sort of trying to address this aspect of how to take this from a one-off sort of improvisational point-in-time approach to create a continuous application security approach. So there's apparently a lot of these train, test, and fix. So we will get through those. And like I said, this is not very scalable. So that's kind of part of what we've been seeing in terms of the organizations. Still very improvisational and still facing a lack of application security skills specifically. It's not uncommon for me to talk to somebody who's the head of application security at his organization, if they're even lucky enough to have that kind of position there, with 20 years background in network security, with somewhat different challenges and different approaches. But if we were to look this is what at least we see, these are the main pain points for clients in terms of addressing this. There's just a lack of knowledge and not a good understanding of how to spread that knowledge. There's a lot of money spent on training courses, but in a lot of respects, not a lot of return on that, or at least the ability to track the return there. They are not very familiar with the process in general. They're starting, like I said, very improvisational and ad hoc. They're not familiar with the tools as well, and so a lot of the effort these days is around automating and integrating these tools and making them easier to use and making them developer-centric as we push the testing to the developers. And just in general, once the application is in production, how to go ahead and try to protect that. I would say across the board that there's kind of very little confidence at many of the organizations that I talk to about their ability to sort of address these challenges. And this is just a survey that we did just to give you an indication of how respondents who were in charge of web application security looked at their critical controls that they can put in place and measures that they can put in place. And this is kind of new, the number one thing here, which is to use more automated and integrated app testing tools. In a lot of respects, that's driven, I think, by the fact that they're really just, a lot of this effort is manually driven, and as more applications are being produced, this doesn't really scale, as we said earlier. So that's the sort of the main push around everything we're seeing nowadays is really and this is where you'll see terms like machine learning and artificial intelligence, and the applicability there is kind of like a wait and see scenario, but it's all around taking the human out of this to the extent that's possible, or at least making the human kind of much more efficient when it comes to this. So they're doing that, and they're also trying to test their applications more frequently in production. So that's kind of the current state. I wanted to quickly take a look at some of the trends overall. One of the things that I guess you won't see here is things like IoT. That's obviously, I think, a very sort of important trend, but what I tried to tackle here, I would say, was relevant to that as well, but tried to be a bit broader. So in terms of the knowledge management that I described earlier, for a while I think there was kind of an emphasis on trying to make developers into essentially security experts, and that started 15 years ago. And as I said, the numbers with many of these top vulnerabilities have not gone down, and in some instances they've gone up. So a lot of the effort, I think nowadays, is in trying to more closely target the security training to the developer when they need it. So if you were to look at some of the application security testing solutions, I mean, actually one of the companies, Checkmarks, is an Israeli company here. They're trying to provide that context, right, for the developer when they're looking at the vulnerabilities. This is one way to try and bring the sort of the focus closer towards the developer when they need it, and to make them sort of better secure coders without necessarily knowing everything about secure coding. And this was just kind of an example of how they would go about to do that. And then in terms of the kind of the application security problem, they're trying to, with organizations, we see a very large trend, I think, about trying to essentially make all of this, as I said earlier, closer to the developer, more relevant to them, and less about sort of security, if you will, but being able to leverage what we know about application security and make it easy and intuitive for the developers. So here, you'll see kind of a diagram of the application security team in a lot of instances trying to embed the security that they require in the process of the mobile developers. So they'll provide checklists for them. If possible, they'll provide security-related SDKs for them. And they'll do all this with an eye towards fitting inside the developers' operations, not the security team asking the developers to do this for security reasons, but essentially trying to embed this as a natural part of the development cycle. And again, all this is geared towards not taking the developers out of their workflow, because I think a lot of organizations have abandoned the idea of trying to make them into security expert developers. It's really about trying to make security as easy as, I guess, humanly possible when it comes to that. And so this is just a sort of a design diagram, but the point being that those things in green there are really the security teams trying to provide the capabilities to the developers to leverage there. And so that's really a big trend that we're seeing. This is the reason I'm trying to call it out, is that the point in time, I think, where the security team sort of acted independently in this scenario is gone, and to the extent that they can try to introduce this as a part of the normal developer's workflow, they've been getting a good deal of results. Obviously, one of the sort of the big trends that a lot of people love talking about or putting on their marketing material is this idea of DevOps. We see quite a bit in terms of DevSecOps as well, but the point for the application security group is that they've just started to get a handle in some respects on introducing application security testing and on dealing with some of these vulnerabilities. And all the while this is happening, what followed that was essentially this need to get faster pace, the turnaround times are shorter, and to really embed into the sort of the development process. And this has been challenging for application security, people charged with application security. I use the term application security teams or groups, but the reality is that a lot of organizations, there's not really necessarily kind of a dedicated group. But here, really, it's, at this instance, the security teams, the AppSec groups are trying to adapt themselves to faster turnarounds, to shorter cycles, to less manual intervention. And these are things that they need a lot of support from the tools, the solutions that they use as well. And so we see a lot of, in application security testing, a lot of movement away from sort of comprehensiveness, if you will, finding every single possible vulnerability, and quite a bit on very quickly providing kind of high value information with a lot of accuracy to try and fit into this kind of model. And that's also, I think, what's driving in large part the need to automate and integrate that the earlier survey addressed, because those are really critical requirements if security testing is going to get adopted in this DevOps methodology. And when like I said, this is kind of a new paradigm for application security teams, and when they look at this, this is the type of slide that I will essentially show them, and I'm just going to go right to the end because it's too big to get to all this. But when they see this type of thing, oftentimes it seems very daunting and quite a bit too challenging. But it's the reality that they, the way that developers and the business is creating applications is changing, and they were already behind in terms of providing security testing and good application security knowledge, and now they have to fit into this sort of this new pipeline as well. And when they're looking here, there's a number of different solutions. There's the software composition analysis to look at the open source and third-party frameworks. There's the they need to do the static analysis, the penetration testing, dynamic analysis, and so we see a move in a lot of respects to driving part of this through services, because the organizations don't have the ability to address a lot of this themselves, and also ideally to look for a single sort of vendor to kind of address that. But this is a complicated scenario that they're trying to embed themselves in. And in the initial sort of traditional approach, the improvisational one that I showed earlier, there was none of this. There was very little of this. And now if they're going to fit kind of into the pipeline from conception into production, it requires embedding themselves not only from a process perspective, but a technological one as well. And so that, that DevOps trend, if I can call it that, is really putting a lot of pressure on application security groups to try to address that. And it's driving a lot of conversation on our end. But the idea at the end of the day is to take all of this, the tools that they use and take all the process that they're trying to address and to essentially make application security testing more scalable, to reach the frequent releases, the hundreds of applications that the business might have, and really to get a comprehensive view of the risk facing the organization. So again, they need speed and accuracy. They need to integrate and automate, and it needs to be easy. It's not going to be security specialists using these tools in a lot of respects. It's going to be kind of developers and auditors, potentially even QA, and then it needs to be easy to consume, and the findings for a large part need to come with a good deal of context for non-security people to understand why it's an issue and how to deal with those types of issues. And this is something that kind of across the board the technology vendors are working on. The outcome at the end of the day is flexibility in how to address the many vulnerabilities that folks have. As the barrier to entering for security testing, that is finding the vulnerabilities in the code, has been reduced quite a bit by services, by many of the vendors that are addressing this. So we're testing more applications essentially, but the problem with that is that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the current approach doesn't scale very well, but it also means that testing is not the end of the road. There's the need to remediate the myriad of vulnerabilities that they find. In the past, I would say that it was very much about addressing it in the code if possible, but part of that was kind of due to, I think, a lack of kind of context and understanding of the entire ecosystem. So in general, the process here is about providing that additional context, working with the development, the operations group, with everybody, with the idea of providing flexibility in terms of outcomes and remediation. So potentially we'll write a firewall rule in this one instance, potentially we'll address it in the code in this other instance, and all of it sort of geared towards being flexible, also in terms of moving forward with the discipline, because as we saw, they just got around to sort of better addressing the traditional approach, and now for the security teams, things are changing way too fast for them to sort of address. So looking forward, in order to kind of remain efficient, but also to be able to address the challenges moving forward, the process and the technology has to be supported in such a way as to be kind of flexible, and to allow for good metrics and continuous improvement. That's not important. And yeah, just to kind of look at the wider range of threats facing application security groups and the ones that calling us. There's obviously the denial of service. There's exploitations that we were talking about earlier. They now have to account, I think, more and more for access violations and abuse of the functionality there. Again, it's not just about, this used to be a large part of the kind of the aspect for the application security group, the exploit part of this. But now they need to look more and more, like I said, at the entire kind of ecosystem. And so they're looking at a number of different solutions. And if you look at this is another one of the sort of the slides that gives those groups a lot of headaches, because there's no kind of one solution, one vendor, one approach that's really allowing them to address this. And certainly this is a lot of the stuff that they might have tried to address in the past in the code itself by making security experts out of the developers. Not all of this, obviously. And so, again, at this point, they're trying to the extent possible, provide this capability and tooling to their developers to introduce early on into the process. And so that's what we mean by sort of externalizing the architecture in parts. That's providing, like I said, SDKs for certain hardening and wrapping and other issues when in the mobile context, but also from the vendor perspective, exposing the entirety of their functionality through plugins and APIs so that it can be leveraged by the developers and the security groups to try and address this. And obviously, the last trend I wanted to kind of address is just that in a lot of respects, the organizations are now looking cloud first for a lot of the applications they're trying to develop, and the protections have, are starting to need to be deployable and addressable to this cloud architecture. So when we talk to clients about application security for these cloud applications, to the extent possible, I think it makes sense to start looking at kind of cloud first solutions to try to address this. With the security controls that you'll put in place. So in that instance, they might look at web application firewalls as a service, cloud firewalls. Essentially look, if you're going to deploy the application in the cloud, which many of them are, all of them are essentially, look to provide that protection and that security as well from the cloud. And look at those, and that'll speak again to needing for the vendors to provide more programmable security controls to put in place. Again, that's exposing the entirety of their functionality through kind of their APIs. They don't know, I think, much like the clients, how they're going to need to necessarily use this tomorrow and how they're going to have to fit into it tomorrow. So again, in order for them to be able to kind of address tomorrow's challenges, it's really about providing the client that flexibility, which comes with the information and which comes with exposing their functionality there. So hopefully that was useful to you guys. My name is Eyal Tirosh, and those were some of the trends that we're observing in application security at Gartner.